Welcome to the strange and mysterious world of terror at Collinwood. 'Tis I, your old pal, Penny Dreadful, here to bring you part 2 of The Shadows Behind the Shadows, my survey or overview of the literary, cinematic, theatrical, television, etc. influences on the many Dark Shadows storylines. But before we get to that, I want to let you know about a few things that are going on. Be sure to pick up Cryptology issue 9 this May. It's a great magazine and it features a Dark Shadows cover with George Wilson artwork from the cover of Gold Key issue number 11 and plenty of Dark Shadows content within, including a Terror at Collinwood advertisement. Tickets are still available via Eventbrite for the Dark Shadows 60th anniversary event. Be sure to snag them while they last. It's happening July 31st through August 2nd, and the link is in the show notes. More news from Catherine Lee Scott in Los Angeles, California. The CMAY Gallery is pleased to present Dark Shadows, a group exhibition exploring the darker, more surreal dimensions of narrative painting. Drawing inspiration from the iconic television series Dark Shadows, 1966 to 1971, and its later reinterpretation in Tim Burton's stylized film Dark Shadows, the exhibition brings together a diverse group of artists whose work navigates themes of mythology, memory, transformation, and the uncanny. Originally airing from 1966 to 1971, Dark Shadows introduced audiences to a world where gothic romance intertwined with the supernatural. Burton's later adaptation amplified the sensibility through a heightened visual language of dark humor, theatricality, and exaggerated atmosphere. Together, these iterations provide a conceptual framework for the exhibition where melodrama and the otherworldly converge, and narrative becomes a vehicle for psychological and symbolic exploration. The artists in Dark Shadows each approach this terrain through distinct cultural and aesthetic lenses. So the CMAY Gallery exhibition is started on April 18th and is going through May 30th. For more information, contact info@cmaygallery.com. That sounds pretty cool. I wish I could make it to that. I don't know if pictures are allowed, but hopefully some will turn up because I'm curious to see how that will be. And last but not least, The Curious Characters of 1795 Collinwood is a new book tribute to the hit series Dark Shadows. It's by George Hernandez, who is the author and illustrator, along with Samantha Lomusio, who is the editor and illustrator. And of course, we know Samantha from the Dark Shadows coloring book and the Dark Shadows Paper Dolls book. However, this is an independent endeavor here. This book is an unofficial fan work and is not authorized or licensed by Dan Curtis Productions or the creators of Dark Shadows. However, it is extremely cool. It's really cute. It's by Haunted Afghan Productions. They present the first book in the Curious Characters of Collinwood series. This is the Curious Characters of 1795 Collinwood. It's a collection of illustrations and poems based on the hit TV series. The book focuses on the characters and events that appeared during the Dark Shadows storyline set in the year 1795. The book depicts a few key moments and characters from the show, and not the entirety of the 1795 storyline, nor every character. The book is done in the style of a retro children's book, intended for fans of all ages who adore Dark Shadows, and it is purely for entertainment purposes. So really cool work here by George Hernandez and Samantha Lomusio. Make sure you pick it up. It's available on Amazon. I'll include a link in the show notes. Twinge of fear and tears that glisten. There are spoilers here for those who listen. So if you haven't listened to part 1 of The Shadows Behind the Shadows, I encourage you to check it out. In that episode, I covered the Victoria Winter's arrival at Collinwood and her search for her parentage, Burke Devlin's revenge, Laura the Phoenix, introduction of Barnabas, the blackmailing of Elizabeth by Jason McGuire. So you have all of that you can check out in the first installment. In this installment of The Shadows Behind the Shadows, we're going to start off taking a look at the influences and inspirations for the 1795 storyline. Now remember, Dark Shadows is the Caspian Sea. It's fed by all these rivers. You can think of it as a giant body of water fed by all these tributaries. The 1795 storyline is the next one we're going to look at. The primary inspiration for the 1795 storyline is The Crucible from 1953, which is a 4-act play by Arthur Miller dramatizing the 1692 Salem witch trials. Set in a rigid Puritan Massachusetts, the story shows how petty grievances, hysteria, and fear of the unknown lead to widespread paranoia, false accusations, and the deaths of innocent people. The 1795 storyline of Dark Shadows was explicitly inspired by Arthur Miller's 1953 play, adapting its themes of mass hysteria, vengeance, and religious extremism. Both narratives center on a community consumed by fear and witch hunts in colonial/early New England. And Angelique has a lot in common with Abigail in The Crucible, who is manipulative, calculating, vindictive, and obsessive. It's Abigail who uses false accusations to drive the witch trial frenzy, to gain power, and to remove Elizabeth Proctor, the wife of her former lover, John. There's a scene between Barnabas and Angelique which directly parallels a scene between John Proctor and Abigail in The Crucible. In addition, I'm fairly certain that they merged elements of The Crucible with the Greek tragedy Medea, written by Euripides and first performed in 431 BC. Medea is a Greek tragedy about a powerful witch who seeks revenge on her unfaithful husband Jason after he abandons her and their 2 sons for a Corinthian princess. Driven by rage and betrayal, Medea uses her powerful magic to kill the princess and her father, King Creon, and then gains monstrous revenge upon Jason by murdering their own children to inflict the ultimate pain upon him. The Angelique and Barnabas and Josette triangle and Angelique's use of her powers to gain revenge is reminiscent of elements in Medea. So I suspect that there was a combination of things going on there. Now, an inspiration for a character in the 1795 storyline would be Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen's 1813 novel, and Nathan Forbes in the 1795 storyline appears to be inspired by Mr. Wickham from Jane Austen's novel. Wickham is a charming, handsome, and manipulative militia officer in Pride and Prejudice who serves as the novel's antagonist. While initially appearing honorable, he is actually a profligate gambler, liar, and seducer who trades on his pleasant demeanor to mask a selfish, immoral nature. He acts as a foil to Darcy, highlighting that charm can mask a lack of integrity. The blogger Danny Horn, who also points out Wickham and cites him as a lieutenant in the militia who sold his birthright and then frittered away his money and then blames Mr. Darcy for his troubles, spends the beginning of the book trying to charm Elizabeth, and then he elopes with Lydia, the youngest and silliest sister of the Bennet family. Mr. Darcy needs to hunt Wickham down and shame him into marrying the innocent young girl that he's ruined. So that's where Millicent comes from, per Danny Horn, the blogger on the Dark Shadows Everyday blog. He also points to Tom Jones as another inspiration for Nathan Forbes. Now, I'm not as familiar with Tom Jones. I think I did watch the 1963 film many years ago. So Danny Horn points out that Tom Jones is the original sexy scoundrel from Henry Fielding's 1749 English comic novel, The History of Tom Jones, a Foundling. I mean, I think he means that Tom Jones was sort of the template for many subsequent like charming rogue type characters. But I think it's pretty clear that Mr. Wickham from Pride and Prejudice was directly the inspiration for Nathan Forbes. But if anyone wants to fill in more on the Tom Jones aspect, I'd be curious to hear that. Now, speaking of Nathan Forbes and Millicent, Gaslight, Patrick Hamilton's 1934 play and the 1944 film adaptation directed by George Cukor, which itself was a remake of the 1940 British adaptation of Gaslight. Gaslight is a psychological thriller where Gregory Anton manipulates his new wife Paula into believing she's going insane. He isolates her in her late aunt's London home, stealing items and dimming the gaslights, while insisting she is imagining it all to hide his own murderous jewel-seeking past. This is directly paralleled in Nathan's scheme to manipulate Millicent Collins in his attempt to convince her that she's going mad. So there's a little subplot that happens in 1795 there. Definitely a riff on Gaslight. The love story of Victoria Winters and Peter Bradford over the centuries is inspired by The Sense of the Past, an unfinished novel by Henry James, published in 1917, but more specifically, it's inspired by the fantasy drama film adaptations of Henry James's novel, Berkeley Square in 1933, directed by Frank Lloyd, and its remake, The House in the Square from 1951, directed by Roy Ward Baker. And Steve Shutt sent me a link to The House in the Square a little while back, which was fantastic. The main character in the play and film versions is named Peter, and the star-crossed love story is more pronounced in the later film adaptations, as are accusations of possession and witchcraft. A description of the 1951 film follows. Peter Standish inherits an old house in Berkeley Square. Obsessed with the past, he feels he belongs in the 18th century. After a lightning strike, he is transported back to 1784. Standish finds himself in the role of his ancestor, shocking those around him with his modern manners and knowledge of the future. He finds the reality of the era, disease and social conditions, different from his romanticized view. Amidst the strangeness, he falls in love with Helen Pettigrew, the younger sister of his intended bride. After his modern ideas lead people to believe he is a sorcerer, he is forced to return to the present day. He discovers that Helen died long ago. In this particular film adaptation, Peter finds love again with Helen's modern descendant who looks exactly like her. So in Dark Shadows, Vicky was the one who goes back in time and falls in love with a fella named Peter. So that's a little bit of a gender reversal there, but really cool. In a case where we do actually get confirmation, at the 1993 festival, Ron Sproat said that before they did the 1795 flashback, Gordon Russell told him, "I'd love to do Berkeley Square if I can figure out how." So clearly he did figure out how, and it was the Vicky and Peter storyline. This quote appears, by the way, in the World of Dark Shadows fanzine, issue 69/70 from April 1995. Another influence on the 1795 storyline is quite likely to have been The Undead, a 1957 horror film directed by Roger Corman. The elements of this film are echoed in Victoria Winters' journey to the year 1795, where she falls victim to the machinations of witch Angelique Bouchard. This parallels the film in which a woman makes a mysterious journey into the past where she is framed for black magic by a jealous witch. After returning to the present, no one believes her. So pretty sure The Undead is in the mix there too, with The Crucible and Berkeley Square. I think all of those were woven together to create the foundation of the 1795 storyline. And finally, one that's very recognizable here, Barnabas luring Reverend Trask to the old house basement and walling him up is, of course, inspired by the short story The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe, published in 1846. In the story, the narrator Montresor lures his friend Fortunato into the catacombs under his palazzo during Carnival, chains him to a wall, and bricks him in alive to avenge a perceived insult. The story is famous for its dark irony, psychological horror, and meticulous planning as Montresor exploits Fortunato's pride in wine connoisseurship to lead him to his death. And speaking of obvious inspirations for Dark Shadows storylines, we move on now to the creation of Adam and Eve and the Dream Curse storylines, which are happening concurrently. First, it goes without saying that Adam is inspired by the 1818 novel Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, and also its most famous film adaptation, Universal Studios' Frankenstein, from 1931, directed by James Whale and starring Boris Karloff. A summary of the novel, for those maybe who have not yet been brought to life by Dr. Frankenstein and are unfamiliar with it. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, published in 1818, is a Gothic novel and also widely considered the first science fiction novel about Victor Frankenstein, a scientist who creates a sentient, grotesque creature from dead body parts. Horrified by his creation, Victor abandons it. Lonely and rejected by society, the creature vows revenge, killing Victor's family and bride, leading to a tragic, obsessive chase that ends in both their deaths. Clearly, Dr. Lang is Dr. Frankenstein. Adam is the analog for the creature in the novel and in the film. Some of the scenes actually in this storyline are direct lifts from Frankenstein. For example, the monster taunting Victor through the window in chapter 23 following the murder of Elizabeth on their wedding night. He's like looking at Victor through the window, and Victor spots the creature grinning and pointing mockingly at her corpse before escaping. This is framed in a similar way in Dark Shadows when Adam mockingly grins at Barnabas and mocks through the window after dumping, I think it was the unconscious Joe Haskell that he dumped in the old house. So it was just like a little nod to that scene in Frankenstein. Another example, Sam Evans becomes the blind man, DeLacy, who befriends the creature. And then here's one from the Karloff film. The creature befriends and plays with Maria before accidentally killing her. It's mirrored in episode 495, where David is in the woods playing with his knife. He's playing Mumblety-Peg, and he meets Adam in the woods, not really realizing his own strength. Adam accidentally hurts David. It's just echoed in that scene. I don't think it's necessary to really dive too deep into this. Frankenstein obviously is the inspiration for the Adam storyline. Now, the Dream Curse was inspired by the 1957 novel The Dreamers by Roger Manvell. Ron Sproat confirmed that at the first Dark Shadows Festival and said that this novel was used as the inspiration for the Dream Curse storyline. And if you jump back and listen to episode 75 of Terror at Collinwood, Steve Schutt and Amanda Desiree joined me as we compared the Dreamers novel to the storyline. So just a brief overview here. The Dreamers is a psychological horror and suspense novel written by Roger Manvell and published in 1957. It's known for its chilling, offbeat portrayal of a dream curse and its exploration of racial and post-colonial themes, and is an early example of psychological horror in the 1950s. The story centers on 5 inhabitants of a village in the Thames Valley near London who begin sharing a terrifying, vivid nightmare that brings them to the edge of unbearable fear. The curse in the novel is referred to as the Dream Curse. In a similar manner to what was seen in the Dark Shadows storyline, the dreamer is driven to tell their terrifying nightmare to another. The dream progresses further each time the dreamer passes it to the next person until it finally reaches its intended victim. There was some confusion about this for a little while because in the Dark Shadows Almanac, the inspiration for the Dream Curse is listed as the Dream Deceivers, which does not exist. That was either a mistake or it was a little cheeky nod, or maybe they misheard Ron Sproat at the festival. It is definitely The Dreamers by Roger Manvell. Now, Eve, the character of Eve, clearly is, again, another one that kind of goes without saying. Universal Studios' classic film The Bride of Frankenstein from 1935, directed by James Whale, was the inspiration for Eve in Dark Shadows. The Bride of Frankenstein is a classic horror sequel where Boris Karloff returns as the monster, Colin Clive returns as Dr. Frankenstein, and we meet Elsa Lanchester as the bride, and Ernest Thesiger as Dr. Pretorius. In the film, Dr. Frankenstein, planning to abandon his experiments, is forced by the sinister Dr. Pretorius and the lonely monster to create a female mate. After the bride rejects the monster, he destroys the laboratory, killing himself, Pretorius, and the bride, while Frankenstein escapes. Eve in Dark Shadows is analogous to the bride in the Universal horror film. In Shelley's novel, we have to remember Dr. Frankenstein actually destroys the monster's mate before she's ever given life. She never comes to life in the novel. It's in the film where that happens. In the film, the bride is brought to life, upon which she famously rejects Frankenstein's monster. Eve is also brought to life and rejects Adam. And of course, we get a much more developed version of the bride in the show, because the bride isn't actually in the film for that long after she comes to life. But Eve, we get a whole backstory for her. And according to the Dark Shadows wiki, Danielle Roget, the life force for Eve, was based on Madame Defarge from A Tale of Two Cities. I'm not sure about that. That one is, I would need more information to make that claim. So if somebody has more information on that, please do feel free to elaborate in the YouTube comments. I mean, I have a basic knowledge of A Tale of Two Cities. It's a historical novel by Charles Dickens, and it deals with the French Revolution, or set during the French Revolution. And I know Madame Defarge, I believe, was an antagonist in the novel, but Danielle Roget, yes, was involved in the French Revolution, but she's sort of a serial killer. She's the most evil woman who ever lived. She's kind of a psychopath. So I don't know if that lines up outside of the French Revolution aspect with the Madame Defarge character. So if somebody wants to elaborate or provide more information, I'd be curious to hear it. Okay, so another Edgar Allan Poe story that is used during this storyline, it begins during the storyline and then it carries into the next storyline, The Premature Burial, the 1844 short story by Edgar Allan Poe. Elizabeth Collins Stoddard's changes to her will and her prearranged burial in a mausoleum with a bell tower, her obsession with her own death. That's the premature burial. The unnamed narrator in the story suffers from catalepsy, a condition that causes him to fall into death-like trances. Terrified that he will be mistakenly declared dead during one of these fits, he becomes obsessed with historical accounts of people who awoke in their coffins. To prevent his nightmare from coming true, he remodels his family vault with safety features including a lever to open the tomb from the inside, a bell with a rope attached to his hand, and supplies of food and water. One night the narrator awakens in total darkness, confined in a narrow wooden space. He smells damp earth, finds his jaw tied shut, and discovers his safety bell is missing. Convinced his worst fear has finally happened, he lets out a blood-curdling shriek. This is a whole subplot during the Adam and Eve storyline and then carries over into the Quentin's Ghost and Werewolf storyline, and that's where it wraps up there. But that Poe story was used as the basis for Elizabeth's obsession with being buried alive. Another, I guess, inspiration here would be Tony Peterson, played by Jerry Lacey. I'm sure they noticed his resemblance to Humphrey Bogart, because how could you not? And he had a very Sam Spade vibe, especially the early Tony Peterson stuff was very Sam Spade. But he had that kind of, he was a lawyer, but he was kind of a hard-boiled lawyer, I guess. But he was, with the cigarette and the trench coat and the way they combed his hair and some of the way some of his line deliveries and stuff were very reminiscent of Bogart as Sam Spade. Now, a scene, I mentioned last time in part 1 of this series that there were nods to Hammer films. There are a couple of them in this storyline. Hammer Studios' 1958 Dracula, released in the U.S. as Horror of Dracula, directed by Terence Fisher and starring Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. In episode 631, Barnabas battles the vampire Tom Jennings by making a cross with 2 candlesticks and forcing him into the light, just like Van Helsing does to Dracula in the film. Also in episode 560, the vampire Angelique meets Joe Haskell in a very similar manner to the way Dracula's bride meets Harker in Horror of Dracula. And speaking of Van Helsing, this is the storyline that introduces Professor Timothy Elliot Stokes. I talked about Dracula last time with regard to its influence on the Barnabas storyline, but here we get the Van Helsing archetype, a sage occult scholar, an academic who knows a lot about the unknown. He's the guy you go to when you need help battling the supernatural. So there you go, Professor Stokes. Now, moving on to the next storyline, Return to 1796. Now, this is a 2-week storyline. They pause the existing storyline, which at this point is the beginning of the Quentin storyline. They pause it, and then they go into 1796. They do a 2-week side trip to 1796. I can't find, it's basically the end of the 1795 storyline that we already saw, but with new twists and turns, where Barnabas goes back and changes things because Vicky's back there now. Angelique is back. So there are new twists and turns. As such, I can't really see anything new there as far as literary or cinematic inspirations. I mean, we have to remember that while Dark Shadows borrowed heavily from all of these sources, there was also a great deal of original material. They would rework existing things into their universe, but often they would also create brand new things as well. Obviously, not everything in Dark Shadows was ripped off from something else. There was a lot of original material in the mix as well. It's just how everything was used and woven together is quite fascinating. But I can't really think of anything specific that was a literary or cinematic inspiration on that 2-week storyline. But if you know of something, let me know. Moving on from that, The Werewolf and the Ghost of Quentin Collins. Again, here we go with a couple of very famous inspirations. The Turn of the Screw, the 1898 novella by Henry James, and also the film adaptation, The Innocents, from 1961, directed and produced by Jack Clayton. The Turn of the Screw is about a governess at a remote estate who believes the children she cares for are being haunted and influenced by malevolent ghosts. Peter Quint is Quentin, Miss Jessel is Beth, The housekeeper, Mrs. Gross, is Mrs. Johnson, and the unnamed governess is Maggie Evans, in terms of the Dark Shadows analogs. There are also elements lifted from the film, such as Miles standing in front of the window as the ghost of Peter Quint appears behind him and both laugh maniacally. This is mirrored in the scene in episode 691 where David sits up in bed and announces that it's too late to be afraid and laughs maniacally. His laughter is echoed by Quentin's laughter from within the house. It's not framed in the same way as it is in the film, but it's the same idea. So it was pretty cool when they did that. And then the other storyline that's running concurrently with the Quentin's Ghost storyline is the Chris Jennings Werewolf storyline. That clearly is inspired by the classic Universal 1941 horror film, The Wolfman, directed by George Wagner, written by Kurt Siodmak, and starring Lon Chaney Jr. The Chris Jennings and Quentin Collins werewolf storylines both borrow elements, aspects, and lore from this classic Universal horror film. The 1941 film, The Wolfman, is about Lawrence Larry Talbot, who returns to his Welsh ancestral home and is bitten by a werewolf while trying to save a woman. Cursed, Talbot struggles with his tragic fate, transforming into a wolf man during full moons. Chris Jennings is portrayed as a tortured character struggling with his monstrous alter ego, a direct parallel to Larry Talbot's desperate attempt to manage his curse. So many elements of werewolf lore came from the Wolfman. The mark of the pentagram, for example, in the 1941 film, a pentagram appears in the palm of a victim destined to be killed by the werewolf. Dark Shadows used this exact plot point, showing a pentagram appearing over the faces of victims, such as a waitress at the Blue Whale that before Chris attacks them. Also, the pentagram used for protection from the werewolf appears in the Wolfman too. And later, during the Leviathan storyline, we'll even hear the famous poem, Even a Man Who's Pure in Heart, the werewolf association with gypsies, and absolutely, werewolves are creatures from folklore like vampires, but much of our mythology surrounding them in pop culture comes from Kurt Siodmak's script. The full moon, all of that stuff. However, silver bullets as a means to dispatch the werewolf do predate the Wolfman. In fact, legend has it that the fearsome beast of Gévaudan was dispatched by a blessed silver bullet in 1767. But yes, the Wolfman was clearly an inspiration. Chris Jennings is the Larry Talbot of Dark Shadows. Now here's an obscure one, and Dr. Andrew Higgins hipped me to this a little while back. The Door Without a Key by Seabury Quinn, first published in Weird Tales in 1939, is the inspiration for the use of I Ching wands in Dark Shadows. The use of the I Ching wands to go back into time through a door is a key plot point in Seabury Quinn's The Door Without a Key. The dialogue in this short story almost matches what Professor Stokes says to Barnabas Collins about how to use the I Ching sticks to travel back in time by throwing them on a table, forming a hexagram, and visualizing a door with this marking that opens into the past. Absolutely, I Ching is also used in The Man in the High Tower, but The Door Without a Key, it's clearly the source, no doubt about it. My guess is that Dan Curtis read this story in Weird Tales when he was a kid and probably still had that issue of Weird Tales, and then he had the writers read it and use it as a basis for the use of the I Ching in the show. Because it's such an obscure story, he had to have had that as a kid. That's the only thing I can think of. Because even with, the stories about the speed readers that are summarizing horror stories for them to use on the show, and the infamous horror Rolodex, even then, where would the only place that I'm aware of that was published was in Weird Tales. I always say Dan Curtis was a fan of the material. If you listen to his interviews, it's clear he was into that stuff as a kid and as an adult too. So I'm guessing he had a copy of that issue of Weird Tales. And I think I'm going to put a pin in it there. I think those storylines, there's a lot in those storylines, but I do have some housekeeping stuff. One thing I forgot to mention last time that I certainly think was in the mix in the Barnabas storyline was Vertigo, Alfred Hitchcock's 1958 film. And this was one that I always had in the back of my head, but I didn't mention it last time. I'm going to read a quote from Ansel Farage's article that he wrote for Daytime Gothic called All Night at the Collinsport Drive-In, and he talks a bit about Vertigo here. Madeline appears to be troubled by the spirit of a madwoman, complete with an ominous portrait. She later falls to her death, only to return seemingly reincarnated as a dead ringer called Judy. Driven by an obsession for his lost love, Scotty forces Judy to become a new incarnation of Madeline, a concept later explored in the early Barnabas and Maggie storyline, where he was fixated on her resemblance to his lost Josette. And then he talks about the mummy as well. So they were taking Dracula, they were taking The Mummy, and probably Vertigo, too, in that mix. Ansel also points out a lot of similarities between the film The Undying Monster and the framework of Dark Shadows, the Gothic framework of Dark Shadows, including the brother and sister living in the house, which we also see in The Uninvited. So Undying Monster may have been in the mix as well. I think a lot of those Gothic characteristics are reflected there as well. A lot of archetypal Gothic imagery is reflected in that film. I got a couple of messages here that I want to read regarding She. Hazatramp73 on YouTube says in the comments that I keep seeing C.E. cited as a possible inspiration for Laura, but I think it's as obvious as Dracula is to Barnabas. She is an immortal who regenerates through fire. I mean, come on. And Barnabas owes more than a little to She. She did the whole reincarnated lover bit before The Mummy. The Hammer film was just a couple of years prior to The Phoenix, but I think Dan and or the writers likely grew up with a superior 30s film produced by Marion C. Cooper. Whatever the case, She must be acknowledged. Now, after recording the episode, I did remember that Aisha and She ages into a shriveled crone before dying, much like Laura did in 1897, so that should have been mentioned. Laura also has a mystical flame, either in an urn or in the fireplace, and never wants it to be put out, so that could be seen as a parallel as well. And I remarked to this effect, and I did call out She in the episode, by the way. I did say that I was pretty sure that it was a hybrid between the Phoenix mythology and H. Rider Haggard's She. Hazatramp73 replies, as you mentioned, Laura's death in 1897 is very similar to She's death and probably the most direct lived. I also think there's something to She's reincarnated lover being a direct descendant, though Laura's MO is even more incestuous. That She is essentially a phoenix and shares visual motifs with Laura is enough to convince me, but I understand that not seeming as concrete as one-to-one aristocratic vampire who insinuates himself into the house next door. I'm sure that they saw the 1930s film. I'm fairly certain that that's the case, combined with the Phoenix mythology. Now, I also heard from my friend and yours, Guy Haynes, with the following. When you talked about the return of Dracula being an inspiration for aspects of Barnabas being a cousin from Europe, you mentioned that you weren't sure if Curtis or anyone saw the return of Dracula. I am 99% certain that he did. Compare the vampire Jenny that cousin Belak sired. Note her slinky white burial gown and how she runs so delicately through the gravestones compared to vampire Carolyn in House of Dark Shadows. The most obvious scene is Jenny's staking. Dan certainly modeled Carolyn's staking from this, the bright red blood in the black and white film, and the bloody staking of Carolyn. The hesitation of the minister, saying, no, she's alive, we buried her alive, is similar to Roger's hesitation, which is hard to hear when he shouts, don't do it, Elliot. I would wager heavily that Dan was a big fan of The Return of Dracula, as am I. And me too. And I did point it out that I think it was probably in the mix there. Like with She, I'm pretty convinced at this point that both of those were inspirations. Now, I have to go through, I know Steve Shutt also sent me a couple of messages a while back about other inspirations for characters and storylines that I may have forgotten. I know there's one that it slips my mind at the moment that I will have to pull up next time and talk about, but I am getting really tired. My voice is starting to go here, so I'm going to wrap this up. But I will say, if there's anything I missed in these first two installments, feel free to leave a comment in the YouTube video explaining your reasoning, and please elaborate as to why you think a certain source may have been used. If you're confident about it, please go ahead. I have seen people online post a lot of different things that I don't necessarily agree with. For example, I've seen people point to novels or films that they feel inspired Dark Shadows storylines, but in many cases, it's simply that those novels were pulling from the same sources Dark Shadows did, or often established many of those characteristics. So I'm talking about plot elements and characters that were lifted, or specific plots that were lifted, not necessarily the atmosphere or the house on the hill with the lightning striking. That's in a lot of Gothic novels, right? So you have to be more specific than that. What are the plot elements, the plot beats, the storyline elements that were lifted? What are the characters that were lifted from the story, that were borrowed, I should say, not lifted, borrowed? I don't want to call the Dark Shadows writers a den of thieves. They were very creative people. So what were the specific plot lines and characters that you feel were used in the show that I may have missed. I've seen a couple of comments about different things that perhaps are not necessarily storylines, but simply reflect Gothic archetypes. I'm trying to be as kind of accurate as possible in terms of like a definitive list of the inspirations for Dark Shadows, of the many tributaries that feed Dark Shadows. So if there's something I missed, please feel free to elaborate in the YouTube comments. And with that said, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, if you enjoyed the podcast, please do like the video. If you're watching this on YouTube, please do subscribe to the YouTube channel. The more subscribers the YouTube channel gets, the better it looks for Dark Shadows. People look at that stuff, believe it or not. So you want to subscribe to the YouTube channel, I would appreciate it. Also, the audio feeds, which is actually where the majority of my listeners come from, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, anybody who's listening to this podcast, I appreciate you. Thank you very much for listening. Please be sure to rate the podcast if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That does also show that a Dark Shadows podcast has enough interest that reflects well on Dark Shadows itself. So if you get the opportunity, I do really appreciate that. And thank you so much for listening. Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.